If you have an interest in philosophy, it is highly likely that you've heard of the term the Gettier Problem. But what is this problem, and why has it bothered Western philosophy for so long? Well, for a start, it is helpful to understand how philosophers have understood the concept of knowledge historically. Although there have been radically different perspectives, the dominant view, for hundreds of years, has been that knowledge is best described as justified true belief. The idea, of course, being that in order to know something, one must first of all have a belief, and that belief has to be accurate. But even more than that, this belief should not simply come from luck or coincidence. The belief has to be held for a reason, and not just any reason, but a good, justifiable reason. This definition of knowledge was held pretty much by every analytic philosopher, because it seemed to capture the essence of what we mean when we say that we know something. But then, in the 1960s, a man named Edmund Gettier came along and presented a short paper named Is Justified True Belief Knowledge? In this paper, Gettier presented examples in which a person seems to be justified in believing something that turns out to be true, and yet it still seems to be inappropriate to say that they have knowledge. Here is a famous example. Alice sees a clock that reads 2 o'clock and believes that the time is 2 o'clock. And in reality, it really is 2 o'clock. There is an issue, however. Unknown to Alice, the clock she's looking at doesn't work. And it just so happens that at the time that she looked, it was indeed showing the correct time. And as a result, Alice has by accident a true, justified belief. Ever since these kinds of arguments, known as Gettier cases, came about, philosophers immediately started formulating new theories in order to explain away this perceived gap in the common understanding of knowledge. Causal theories of knowledge, virtue epistemology, sensitivity theory, and more. However, I would like to show a very simple yet controversial way of understanding the Gettier problem. When I was first introduced to Gettier cases, people were explaining the situation more or less in the same way that I did previously. The consensus was that knowledge must at least be a true justified belief, and that somehow we had to add something in order to avoid some weird cases. But to be honest, my first reaction to this kind of thinking was that I simply did not think that knowledge had to be justified. Before beginning to learn anything about philosophy, my notion of knowing something simply meant that you had an idea about something, and that idea happens to be reflective of how the world actually is. In other words, to me the most intuitive way of looking at knowledge is to just say that knowledge is merely the holding of a true belief. Justification is simply the set of systems through which we come to acquire knowledge in a reliable way. But of course, no matter how reliable a system is, there will always be times where it will not produce the correct result. Likewise, no matter how unreliable it is, like with the case of the broken clock, there will always be a time where it will produce the correct result. But notice how this analysis does not hurt or diminish the constitution of knowledge in any way. Knowledge is simply the condition of believing something that is true. And justification is simply a way of reaching that condition more often than not. But let me demonstrate this through an example. Suppose that we lived in a world where, by using sufficiently advanced technology, scientists have managed to create a program generator whose only task is to produce computing programs that answer questions in valid format, but with no reasoning behind why they choose a certain answer over another. And not only that, but in fact this program has a sense of self-concept and an inbuilt attitude to always strongly believe the answers that it produces. Of course, when faced with any question, most programs would answer wrongly, as they have no built-in justification system of epistemic values to make it more likely to select true beliefs instead of false beliefs. But no matter how unlikely, if this process of program generating and question asking were to go on ad infinitum, at some point there would be a program that generates every correct answer to every possible question in the entirety of epistemic inquiry. In other words, it would be able to identify the truth about any given valid proposition. Say then that every one of the generated programs are individually chosen as a knowledge guide, each in one possible world. Of course, in many possible worlds, the programs would guide people towards false beliefs, but indeed there would be at least one possible world in which the chosen program actually generates every single true belief about the world. The persons of that said world would of course have no justification for believing that for any given proposition the program would know the truth, since even in the case where it constantly answers correctly, they would know that the program only did so by sheer coincidence. The question that I would like to pose then is this: given that all of the program's propositions constitute true beliefs, and that the program also strongly believes so, then would it really be false to say that this program knows everything? Even when it comes to the facts about its justifications, the program does believe that it has no grounds for believing its own propositions, and yet at the same time it does believe that all its propositions are true. And funnily enough, in both accounts, it is correct. Surely to some this thought experiment may seem problematic. Surely the fact that the program has no reliable way of knowing how it knows things showcases that it doesn't really know. However, I would like to suggest that this kind of response is merely an intuitive annoyance and not an actual problem for my stance. What the critic means by stating that the program wouldn't really have knowledge is that it would not be able to explain to others, or to itself for that matter, why it is that it believes what it believes. But let us ask ourselves this question. In a world where this program actually has every true belief about every single thing, does the method of accessing these truths really matter, as it pertains to believing these truths? Sure, if some of its propositions were true and some were false, then methods of justification would hold a lot of value, because we would need them in order to discover the truth of its false propositions. But if all its propositions are true, then the program and everyone who believes its propositions would have no use of such methods of justification. Why would one look for justification when all of one's beliefs are true? What I want to point out through this example is not that justification is not necessary for acquiring knowledge in a reliable way, but rather that justification is of only instrumental and not intrinsic value when it comes to knowing anything. The act of holding true beliefs remains crucial for knowledge, even in the possible world where the program holds every true belief, whereas the same cannot be said for the act of justification, which becomes utterly obsolete. And if a term is obsolete for the formulation of a definition, then it should not be part of that definition. This is why knowledge ought to be regarded as merely true belief. Please tell me your thoughts about this issue in the comments below, And thank you all for watching.